Hello everyone, this is the first video lecture on the final chapter of our semester, which is death and dying. Yes, or dealing with death and dying. I don't know about you, but this is a topic that I think is actually pretty interesting. Our culture is kind of funny about death. We live in a culture that has been described as a death denying and a death defying culture. And what that means is basically people don't talk about it. We do everything we can to avoid it. It's separate from us. We don't like to discuss it. We don't prepare for it. We don't have any death education, and it's the thing that 100% of us, every single one of us alive, is going to experience death. There is a video that goes with this chapter, one of the assignments, and what I ask you to consider in that chapter or in that assignment is death with dignity, and that's really the emphasis of this chapter. The emphasis is how or what would be considered a good end of life is what we'd call death with dignity, and I'll talk a little bit about what that means. Well, I can tell actually now what that means is that you have some say in how your death will go. Another assignment in this chapter is where you're asked to write a letter to your loved ones where you describe that. What kind of death do you want? And the purpose of this assignment and one of the reasons to have a conversation like this is so that we don't make our end of life harder on the people that we care about. So, talk about it. Well, the point of that assignment is that we do put some thought into it, and we make these decisions before, so that our family members who are going through a very stressful time with our death don't have to do that. Also, okay. Well, I'll probably get more back to that in a second. All right, so a couple different things. We have this what was referred to as functional death versus brain death, and the way scholars are thinking about death these days is that it's a process. That because our bodies are made up of many systems that keep us alive, it's not that we're alive 1 second and we're dead the next. That the systems kind of shut down, kind of like I guess as a computer would shut down. So functional death refers to when our heart has stopped beating and we have ceased to breathe. But this may not be the same point of a brain death. And we could also have a brain death without a functional death. So our brain could be no longer processing, but our heart could still be beating, and we could still be, probably still wouldn't be breathing, but the cognitive part of our heart. There have been, I've read some stuff about researchers trying to understand this process, and I remember reading an account of a research project, and it was being done by heart surgeons, I believe it was. And one thing that people who have had a near death experience describe is that they are above their body. They leave their body and they're looking down. And so what these researchers had done is in the surgery room with this really risky surgery, right, where they stop your heart, and sometimes his heart will stop and then they will come back, is they had put these images way up high in the operating room so that the only way a person could see them is if they had left their body and they were sort of at the top of the room. And they were the researchers, the article was about how they could use that technique, and if people were able to see those images, then they could prove that their spirit had indeed left their body. Another thing I think about is in the episode of Breaking Bad. There was a first season. There was remember the character in Breaking Bad is a chemist, and there is a scene where he and a colleague of his have taken the human body and they have broken it down into all of its elements, and they're able to account for 99.5 of the weight of the body. And they said, well, maybe that's what the soul weighs. Maybe the soul is 0.5% of the weight of the human body. But anyway, I find this topic to be kind of interesting. The rest of the slide outlines, or mentions, makes reference to some significant aspect of death at different stages in the life course. For instance, death in infancy is more like the most common ones would be miscarriage and SIDS or accidents. The most common death in childhood is accidents. One of the questions I asked you earlier in the semester is did you know anyone in your childhood who died? Adolescents, because the sense that they're invulnerable, that they're invincible, they take risks. Young adulthood, people seem to get very angry when young adults die. The most common cause, I believe, of young adults is vehicle accidents. Middle age, this is interesting that for middle-aged people, the fear of death is greater at this stage, and I would be considered middle-aged than at any other stage in their life. I do think that I can attest to that death is like never too far away from my conscious awareness. And then late adulthood, this is a time actually of more risk of suicides, and this is particularly true of men. If I were to ask you what age group has the highest percentage of deaths by suicide, it would actually be late adulthood after you get to retirement. In middle adulthood, the highest risk of death to women is heart disease, right? Is heart attacks, women in their 50s. Another important term from this slide is this one right here, terminal decline. Sometimes the term sometimes the term isn't terminal decline, it is a terminal drop. And what that refers to is for all ages, this is a quiz question, so you should star it, is that for all age groups prior to death, right, just a few days or maybe days prior to death, there's this rapid cognitive decline as people. And so people who have spent a lot of time around death come to recognize what this decline looks like. And it doesn't matter if this is a person who's old or a young person, but there's this rapid cognitive drop. Different cultures respond to death differently, and I just looked this word up and now I can't remember. Thanatology is the study of death and dying, right? Some cultures or some individuals even will regard death as like a punishment. For some, it's this beginning of something new. You've shed this body and you moved into something else. If one is in pain, death might be seen as a release from suffering. Others, and as I was saying in the beginning of this video lecture, our culture is a death denying and a death defying culture. It's seen as, even though it's inevitable and it's everywhere, like everyone's going to die, we do it kind of in private and we do it away from, and it's like this abstract thing. Once upon a time in American history, everyone would have it would have been a frequent practice to have set the death watch, right? That's when you sit at the bedside. But now not very many people have that experience. And some argue that that's the reason that it's so scary is because we don't see it, right? We're not around it. I can say that when my dad was dying, the experience of having simply been so close to death changed my attitude, made me less afraid. And some promote this idea of a death education, which would simply be the same way we might go through, we have birthing education. We might also have a class on how does death, what are the steps? What are the sequence sort of events? Yeah, and certainly we have some for some individuals in the helping community, but for the most part, we as just common citizens don't go through any death ritual or death preparation. I'm going to stop right here, and when I come back, I'll talk about grief.